All of us in this room, or I could probably say across the board, have a view of who Jesus is. From a Barna study from several years ago, there was a couple statistics that came out. And the first question was this: believe Jesus Christ was a real person who actually lived. Millennials said 87% said yes. Gen Xers, 91%. Boomers, 95%. Elders said 96%. They said, yes, Jesus was a real man. But what was interesting, though, was when asked the question was, I believe Jesus was either God, only a religious or spiritual leader, or not sure, we see the answers change dramatically to, yes, Jesus was a real person, but who was he really? I believe Jesus walked this earth 2,000 years ago, fully as a man, fully as God, but maybe he wasn't fully God. Maybe he was just a good teacher. Maybe I'm not sure. We could see the answers there. Then we can also go to one more question that will help us have an understanding about what do people think about Jesus. We saw how high the numbers were for people who believe Jesus really walked this earth, but then when asked the question, when Jesus lived on earth, he was human and committed sins like other people. We can see how these answers are all over the place, with somewhat agree strongly or don't know or disagree strongly of how people believed Jesus lived here on earth. But we have to ask ourselves, what about us? What about you this morning? When we think about the person of Jesus Christ, what is it that you think about him or know about him? Maybe he's just the man you've left in the building, left for the Sunday service. Maybe your answers fit with one of those up there. But all of us, regardless of where we're at in our life, where we're at in our spiritual journey, we all have something to think about or we believe to be true about who Jesus is. We all do. We're going to see this morning as Jesus goes to his hometown that the people he grew up with had something to think or say about who Jesus was. And what they thought about Jesus will hopefully give us some insights into our own hearts about what we believe to be true about Jesus. But there's an interesting connection, though. What we believe to be true of Jesus, we might be getting back out of him kind of what we put in is going to be the idea. If we believe one way of Jesus, maybe we're receiving either nothing, or we believe something about Jesus and we see how he works. Now, that might be vague, but we're going to see how this all comes together this morning. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn me to Mark chapter 6. We're going to begin in verse 1. If you have a tablet, you can open up your tablet or phone. And if not, all the verses will be on the screen behind me as well. And this is the New Living Translation. So it says this: Jesus left that part of the country, right? Last week we finished off in Mark chapter 5 with the story of Jairus and the woman. And he's returning now with his disciples to Nazareth, his hometown. And so Jesus, the word here, right, when we read the Bible, there's details in there that help us see things. So when there's the words in there, we need to really be able to look at that. So it says, he goes to his hometown, but who's with him? His disciples. So Jesus was bringing his disciples to his hometown for part of ministry. Jesus was not just going home on vacation. He was not coming home for Thanksgiving break by himself. He was bringing his disciples along because he wanted them to see what he would do in his hometown. Just like we see the disciples with Jesus, and they see his miracles, or they're a part of his miracles. They're a part of the ministry because remember, Jesus is going to leave this ministry. He's going to leave the future of the church in the disciples' hands one day. So his disciples are coming with him to his hometown. The next Sabbath, he began teaching, verse 2, in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Okay, so the first thing we see when he gets home, he begins to teach, and people are amazed. Then they asked, where did he get all this wisdom and power to perform such miracles? Verse 3, then they scoffed, he's just a carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph, Judas and Simon. And his sisters, they live right here among us. they were deeply offended and refused to believe in him. And so we see here, right in the same instant, they were amazed but didn't believe. They were amazed but didn't believe. You see, we can know everything there is to know about Jesus. You can study him like your 8th grade social studies textbook and yet still not believe. And this gets into our hearts this morning. We show up, we go through the motions, and maybe yet we don't believe. Or we think, yeah, he was a great fill in the blank, but yet we don't believe. Here in his hometown, they're amazed by Jesus, but they don't believe. But again, it's interesting. When we read the scriptures, when we read the Bible, it's easy just to gloss over stuff. Just think nothing of it. But what they say of Jesus gives us great insight to why they didn't believe in him. Here's the first one. It says they scoffed, he's just a carpenter. He's just a carpenter. Which this word, tekton, is a craftsman in wood, stone, or metal, or it's a craftsman in general. So this word that they used for carpenter was someone who had a lot of skills and trades. You probably know somebody in life like that. Realistically, I hate people like that. Because everything they can touch, it turns out really good. And I can't even put a hammer with a screw in a wall. So, you know those type of people we're talking about. They're good at all the craftsman stuff, right? And if not, they can watch a video in 3 minutes and then figure it out as if they've been doing it for years. But it's a very general word for a craftsman who could be good at many different things in such a case. So this idea of a craftsman, though, really ultimately comes down to a person who's a common person. They're just an everyday type of person, but it's a very common word that was used for someone who could work with their hands. And so Warren Wiersbe says this: he was a commoner, and the people saw no reason to commit themselves to him. He was common to them. Maybe we can look at it this way. There's a story of the first ever they call him the labor mayor of any London borough, and his name was Will Crooks. Will Crooks grew up in a poor home, and so at a young age he tried to grab a skill, a trade, to try to bring in money for the family, and so he became a blacksmith. But it was through that he had the type of personality that would excel. He would go to become better, and he eventually worked his way up. Long story becoming short, of becoming the first ever, what they consider labor mayor of any London borough. But at one time, he was out as he was as he was mayor, and he was going around and talking to people, when all of a sudden, he hears in the back this woman say, "They made a common fellow the mayor. How can we trust him? He's just like any of us. He's not special. How can he lead us? He's just like us." And so this is what his family say, the family or the hometown was saying, Jesus, he's just like us. It's interesting to think about. Some of these people might even have had work done in their house by Jesus. They might even have had the chair that Jesus built that they rocked on every night by the fireplace. And they're like, now he's back. I admire the work he had done by building that stool, or that fixing my front porch. I admired that work that Jesus did, but miracles? Believing in him for something more? Nah. He's just a carpenter. He's too common to be anything special. He's too common to be anything else. So that's how the people saw him. Just a common, everyday person. Let's look at this idea of common, though, in a different way as well. And so when you think about Jesus and Jesus working in your life or doing something amazing in your life, what is it you're looking for? What is it you're looking for? Are you looking for, when you're driving down the road, for fireworks to start going off? Or for Jesus just to do this huge thing that you're like, you know what? Unless this tree falls over in my front yard, then I'm not going to believe in Jesus. But remember, Jesus is common. This is one of the amazing things about Jesus, actually. That this word common is actually a fascinating thing. Because even as Steve just said, he became like us. We're all this common people, and this is the amazing thing of the gospel, that God sent his Son to be like us. Why? Because he had to take our place to take our sin. It's common, but yet it's a miracle. But what is it you're looking for? In our minds, we might think, well, it has to look like this for Jesus for him to work in my life. Or we're looking for the fireworks, for something crazy to happen. As I was having a discussion with a friend this past week, he brought up this verse to me, these verses in Matthew 25, starting in verse 40. Jesus talking and says, again, the king will say, I tell you the truth, when did you do it to one of these least of my brothers and sisters? You're doing it to me. For I was hungry, and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, and you didn't give me a drink. I was a stranger, you didn't invite me into your home. I was naked, you didn't give me clothing. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me. Then they will reply, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick in prison and not help you? And he will answer, I tell you the truth, when you refuse to help the least of these my brothers and sisters, you're refusing to help me, Jesus says. What if he's in the common things of life and that's where he shows up? What if his miracles begin in the common things of life? I remember this scripture vividly as a group of guys one night, probably about 6 years ago, were hanging out. We were doing a study, and we were going through these exact verses. And it was amazing how sometimes, you go through a verse, and all of a sudden, it's almost like if God tests you to see, hey, you're talking about this, right? Because sometimes that's the hardest thing in Christianity, to see what we see, but then get it into our heart to live it out. And so as we were going through this guy who I actually met him through the job fairs, and he sent me a message and said about needing a ride. And it was turning to the point where it would be a late at night thing, but I'm like, at first, the first thing in my mind said was, you know what? I'm just going to tell him I'm tired, I got to go home. All right? That's the easiest thing, and I could probably rationalize that. But then you're reading something like this, and you're like, I guess I have to go pick him up. And so what it was I had to go way out to where he lived, pick him up, take him downtown here in Rome to pick up his children that he had, a visitation with, and then bring him back to his house. Right? I think it was 11:30 midnight at that point. But you know what? That night it opened the door to a tremendous conversation about the gospel. And Jesus worked in that way where I was so easy to say, you know what, I'm tired. All it is a ride, for goodness sakes. But Jesus had more in mind, and it was a very common thing that Jesus wanted to show up. And so when we think about Jesus working in our lives, maybe we have an idea of what is it. These look like this. Listen, if anybody comes into my hometown, they better be better than a craftsman if they're going to show me some miracles. But what am I missing? All the time, where Jesus is at work or wants me to be at work, and I miss it. What might I be missing when I think, you know what, Jesus, it looks this way or it shouldn't look this way. What is it that I'm missing that you're already doing in my life? And then we sit there and say, well, I don't see God doing anything in my life. But yet maybe we just miss it because we're just looking for something else other than really what he's already doing or what he's done. Let's go to another one. Again, we can gloss over the scriptures and miss these things really quick. The first thing is they scoffed and they said, this man is just a carpenter. The next thing they say out of their mouth is, he's the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and his sisters live right here among us. Jesus was familiar to them. So the first thing is he was common to them, but now he's familiar to them. And maybe you've heard some of these ideas before. The first thing familiarity does is it breeds contempt. An extensive knowledge or close association with someone, but it leads to a loss of respect for them or it. Or how about this one? Familiarity breeds indifference. It's a lack of interest in someone or something. The more you're familiar with something, the more we grow just to not be interested in it anymore. Or it's one of those things that as you take your familiar route to work every day, right? Or your familiar route to the grocery store. You probably drive by things all the time that you don't even notice anymore that maybe you once did. Or maybe a house changes its siding. And you're like, wow, that's new siding. Like, yeah, it changed 6 months ago. But you're so familiar with it that you just miss it. But this one, I believe, really hits home for those especially who've been followers of Christ for a long time. This is where I need your help. This is where our brainstorming comes together. How might we become too familiar with Jesus? What might this look like in our life? Anybody have any thoughts? What's that? Sure. Yeah, it's kind of, I'm not sure if it's exactly the way you're going, but like one time I'm praying for my kids for bed, and they look at me and they're like, Dad, why do you pray the same prayer every night? Right? It's like one of those things that I can just pray without even like, I'm not even literally, it's like why do you pray the same way? Like, all right, got me. You know, that can be a great way in our prayer life. We just do it, right? Sure. Rituals? Sure. And we become more maybe familiar with the rituals than Jesus, or maybe a ritual's taken and we're like, whoa, what's going on with that? But it's really not about Jesus. Yeah, what else? Okay, right, we sing the songs without worshiping. That could be one. John.
Oh, I know where he's going with this.
Yeah, I already know it. Sure. And especially in our culture of so much knowledge or so much, whatever, it can be easily become like just kind of tune it out. I read a statistic the other week. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but they say for people who claim to believe in Jesus, follow Jesus, and they go to church, 80% of those people only read the Bible in church. Now, that can become a familiar thing. It's like, I got my routine down. I got my Christian routine down. I got what I do for my Christian routine. Any other ones that come to your mind? Music, okay. Familiar with the music we listen to? Sure. Right, going to church, right? Perfect one. How easy is it to go through the motions of going to church? Maybe for you, you're brand new and it's something new. But for some people, it's one of those things, I've just been doing it. I've been doing it for years. It's just something I do. I'm on autopilot when I'm going to church. And there's good things about that, don't get me wrong, but there can be bad things about that. It's just we're going through the motions. We're here because we know we need to be here. We know we're here because we need to be here. Let's stick in that one. When you got in your car this morning, someone picked you up to come to church, what did you expect Jesus to do when you got here? What did you expect out of this morning? You see, far too often, it's like, you know what, I already know what's going to happen. I'm going to go to church, sing some songs, see a terrible welcome video by Pastor Bryce, and then we're going to go downstairs and we're going to have coffee, and that's what we're going to do. But what did you actually expect Jesus to do? You know, last week was absolutely amazing that maybe you most people might not see. But last week's message we shared about the Jairus and the woman, that message was planned 6 months ago. All these messages have been planned for months. I mean, they haven't been done, but what's going to be preached on a certain Sunday have been done 6 months in advance. And last week we had people here who literally had diagnoses that week of despair. Met with Jesus' hope. We had people walk in the doors that maybe haven't been here with things on the earthly perspective that are of despair. And we said this is a message of Jesus meeting us with hope in the midst of our despair. Whose voice are you going to listen to? And I had countless people come up to me and say, that one, I'm listening to all the wrong voices. But do we believe that when we get together on Sunday morning, that Jesus is going to show up and do something in our midst? Or when you walk in the door with a pain or a heartache, that God knows your story. He knows what's going on with you. And there might be a song to sing, a communion shared, or someone downstairs that you say, God, I know you're going to show up and speak something into my life today. Do you expect that when you walk in the doors? Or do you say, here I go again. Hope they play the music I like. Hope they, have coffee that's a little bolder than last week. I've heard it from some of you. What do you hope he does? Because what you hope he does might be how he shows up. So what do you expect? Because if you don't expect anything, it's probably what you're going to get. Now, there's always an exception to the rule. We could say, like in Paul's case, Jesus meets him in a tremendous way, but there's always the exception to the rule. But in many cases, if we don't expect anything out of Jesus, if you're here on autopilot this morning, that's probably all you're going to get out of him. And it has nothing to do with Jesus. It has everything to do with you. It's your heart. We talked about Mark chapter 4, parable of the soils. What's happening is it's landing on a heart that's not willing or ready to receive him. This is kind of where he goes next. Let's go back on with our story now, starting in verse 4. Then Jesus told them, a prophet is honored everywhere else except in his hometown and among his relatives and his own family. And because of their unbelief, he couldn't do any miracles among them except to place his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And my guess is the few sick people that were there were not a part of this group scoffing at him. They're probably honestly people who were sick, who are way out in the outskirts of town that couldn't get to him, and he went to them. But that's one of the most powerful verses in the Bible right there. And because of their unbelief, he couldn't do any miracles among them. Their heart was like the footpath that we looked at a couple weeks ago. Their heart was cement. They were amazed, yet they didn't believe. They couldn't see beyond the common and the familiarity of Jesus. They knew him all too well. This is what a sight knowing Jesus says. It was not that Jesus was rendered impotent or powerless because the people had no faith. It was not that his divine authority was neutralized in the absence of faith. Christ was no faith healer. He was the Almighty God, exercising his divine authority appropriately over sickness and sin. But Jesus knew that performing miracles among this rebellious, unbelieving crowd would not cause them to believe on him, but rather intensify their guilt and harden their heart even more. This idea here, when it says, because of their unbelief, he couldn't do any miracles, one of the translations of that is that he could not reveal his power to them. His dunamis power, which is the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. It's using the same word there. But we have to realize this in the spiritual realm, that Jesus' work is limited in a climate of unbelief. Can he still show up and do anything? Of course he can. He can. But we also see Jesus' work is limited in a climate of unbelief. Here's a good connection here, Hebrews 11:6, because again, we might think, oh, well, then I just have to believe and then Jesus is going to do this. It's not a cosmic vending machine. But there's a great link between our faith and Jesus working, the condition of our heart and Jesus showing up. Hebrews 11:6 says, it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists and he rewards those who sincerely seek him. He says right here, it's impossible to please God without faith. So I ask the questions in my life. What do you believe Jesus wants to do in your life? What do you believe he wants to do in our church? What do you believe Jesus wants to do in our community? Now, maybe these are questions that aren't even on your radar, but they should be as believers. We should believe that Jesus wants to do something here in our midst all the time. Maybe you can't get by the first question this morning, and I get that. But what do you hope Jesus does in your life? Now, again, he's not like a cosmic vending machine. It really should be something like, Lord, whatever it is you want to do, that's what I want for my life. But you say, here I am. Here I am. And the story closes like this. Mark 6:6, and he was amazed at their unbelief. Now again, easy just to skim over stuff. ESV translates it like this. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went among the villages teaching. Which, this is kind of fascinating, isn't it? He didn't throw himself a pity party, did he? Right there it says, he marveled at their unbelief. He's like, all right, I'm going to other villages, see ya. It's on you all that Jesus doesn't want to show up. But this word marveled here only shows up 2 times that Jesus ever marvels at someone's faith. It's this passage where he marvels at his hometown. And it's a story in Matthew chapter 8 of a Roman centurion who comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, would you heal my servant? Basically, he says, all you have to do is say it, and he's healed. And it says that when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. It's the only 2 times that Jesus ever marveled at someone's faith. The other thing, though, about this, they say, is this may be the only place where Jesus ever marvels at anything. He didn't even necessarily marvel at when the miracle was done. He didn't marvel at the grand countryside. He didn't marvel at the Sea of Galilee, but he marveled at people. He was marveled over people's faith. Because at the end of the day, that is the greatest thing. That's what he's looking for out of us. To be a people of faith who believe in him. It is by believing that we are saved, a free gift of God. But as believers in Christ, this is the idea in Mark, is we need to go from unbelief to belief, that we can have areas of our life that we say, Jesus, I just don't believe you. Or areas of our life where it's just too common, or areas of our life where it's just too familiar. And we could probably begin to throw in other reasons why we don't believe in Jesus, because when something went wrong in our life, he didn't do what we wanted him to do. And we say, it's not real. But Jesus is looking for us to be a people of faith. Yes, in this passage, we don't see anyone repent, but we see unbelief, and we see Jesus' response to their unbelief. And we could talk deeper, and hopefully if you're in a small group, we can talk more about what does that look like to believe? What does that look like to have belief? Is it a head thing? Is it a heart thing? Is it a living out thing? But what I want you to wrestle with this week, what would Jesus think about you? Would he marvel at your belief or your unbelief in life? What would Jesus think about you? Now, this isn't to beat us up, but it's to give us a realistic, right? Steve started us out with communion, talk about examining ourselves, looking inside of ourselves, taking a diagnostic of where we're at in life. But let me tell you this, Jesus can show up in your life, but if you're keeping him over here saying, I'm good, I can do it myself, I can fix this problem myself, I don't need Jesus, then that's probably what you're going to get, yourself. Right? Or you're over here saying, I'm not really going to believe in him for this, right? My intuition tells me this. Well, that's probably what you're going to get out of life. He can still show up. There's always the exception to the rule. But it's oftentimes I found when we hit rock bottom, when we hit a place in life and say, Jesus, you're the only one that can handle this. That's faith right there. Saying, here, I'm putting it in your hands. You do something with this, Jesus. My hands are off of it. And he will show up and do things when you do that, because there's a peace to surrendering our hearts and lives to him that corresponds with belief. Belief doesn't say, Lord, I know what you're going to do with this. Belief doesn't say that I got it figured out. Belief says, I got no clue what I'm doing, but Jesus, you can, and here you can have it. You do something with this. And then we leave the results up to him. So this week, wrestle with this question. What would Jesus do? Would he marvel at your belief or unbelief? Think about that this week. Put that somewhere to think about, pray about, and say, Lord, show me. And show me areas of my life that maybe I don't have belief, or I have unbelief. And lastly, as we always do, I'll repent and believe. What is Jesus saying to you this morning? And how does he want you to respond? What is he saying to you? And how does he want you to respond?